She has written often-cited law review papers, articles on vaccine law and policy, and is the co-author and co-editor of the book Vaccine Epidemic and an upcoming book about HPV vaccines. She has lectured widely and has appeared in several documentaries and on various television and radio broadcasts. Welcome, Mary.
And thanks to all of you here at Informed Choice Washington. It's really a privilege to be here. So I want to talk about the law related to vaccines. Tatiana gave us a fantastic discussion of the science of vaccines and how they relate to herd immunity. I'm going to focus on legal issues. And following Tatiana's example, I thought we should focus on 5 questions. So the first one is, why do we have mandates in the first place? And then the next questions we'll get to one by one. So especially, why do we have mandates if the global standard for ethical medicine is prior, free, and informed consent? That was hugely established starting in the 1920s and then coming out of World War II as this human rights standard. And the US, along with 192 other countries, ratified that standard of prior, free, and informed consent for all medical interventions, including preventive ones, in 2005 in what was called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Bioethics. There were no specific carve-outs for vaccines. And in fact, with a then student, we went back and looked at the legislative history. They talked about vaccines and they said, no special exceptions. So there are exceptions in this declaration if there is some kind of medical emergency, but for general routine care, there is no exception to prior, free, and informed consent. So how do we in the United States have mandates, and how do most countries in the world have mandates? So how we ended up with mandates is the smallpox epidemics. Okay. So in the 1800s, in the 1700s, there were terrible, fatal smallpox epidemics. And it often was a matter of state law whether or not communities would impose mandates or not for vaccination or impose quarantine. And finally, in 1905, a case coming out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, came before the U.S. Supreme Court. And one person, one of our forebears, Reverend Jacobson, said, this is a matter of conscience. This is my religious, I get to decide what happens to my body. And he made many of the arguments that many of us here today feel very strongly, but he lost in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court actually wrote, I think, a pretty good decision for 1905. We're in 2018 now, but for 1905 it's a pretty good decision. And we have to remember what the context was then. Interestingly, this was a mandate for the adult population. They specifically excluded children as being more medically fragile and vulnerable. It was about one vaccine. Smallpox is an airborne fatal disease, and there was a fine for noncompliance. So it was a misdemeanor, but it was a relatively small fine. But the Supreme Court's decision has a number of important principles in it. It says that it had to be a necessary mandate. It said that it had to be a reasonable mandate. It said that it had to be proportionate to the outbreak and to the threat. There had to be some kind of avoidance principle. If somebody could say, I've had a smallpox vaccine before, I nearly died, I can't get it again, that had to be a part of the court's decision. It couldn't discriminate against any particular groups. And there's language in that decision that I really love. And it says, there might be a discriminatory abusive mandate, and courts have to be able to step in those circumstances to overcome any abusive mandates. But that doesn't explain the whole story. That was a mandate for the whole community and particularly for the adult population. How do we end up with these mandates so that kids can't go to daycare and kindergarten? Like, where does that come from? So that comes from another Supreme Court decision in 1923, Zucht v. King. And this is a very different case, and they imported all the logic of Jacobson without really looking at the different facts, in my opinion. So this was a case about a child going to school, and there was no smallpox outbreak at the time in this community, but this was a case from a state that had the requirement that children get a smallpox vaccine before entering school. And the family argued there's no outbreak, there's no basis, there's no necessity. Under Jacobson, we shouldn't have to. And the court decided, no, we don't have to wait for an outbreak of a fatal disease to say that a vaccine mandate makes sense. So between Jacobson and Zucht, those literally are the only two cases that have ever come before the U.S. Supreme Court related to vaccine mandates. So those two cases, in my opinion, have been exceptionally over-broadly interpreted. So courts tend to be extremely deferential not only to those precedents, but they're very, very deferential to the legislatures. Another part of Jacobson is it says the legislatures get to decide. You guys elect them, they get to hear the science. If you guys don't like those legislators who put these mandates in place, you can vote them out, but we're going to defer to the legislators. And courts since 1923, almost without exception, have deferred to the legislators and to mandates that the legislators put into place. Okay, so where are we now? This is to 2016, but now we're at a place where we have 16 federally recommended vaccines, 69 doses, and most states have a subset of those that are required for school entrance. Most states don't yet require annual flu vaccines, most do, but they require most of these shots on the CDC recommended schedule. Okay, and we can come back to questions to any of this at the end. So if we don't vaccinate, what are the consequences, right? So we have these state law mandates, but what happens if you don't choose to vaccinate or you have some reason not to? So based on Jacobson, all 50 states must have medical exemptions. They're construed often very narrowly by state health departments, and the Centers for Disease Control construes them very narrowly, but every state must have medical exemptions. The majority of states, 47 states, the vast majority of states have religious exemptions. So even after Jacobson came into place, there were many people with strong religious convictions not to take vaccines. So religious exemptions are still sort of the first order of non-medical exemptions. After that, many states had introduced, no religious component of philosophical exemption. There has been a strong effort to eradicate those philosophical exemptions. However, they still exist in 17 states. And also some states have proof of immunity exemptions. If you can show that a child has or an individual has a certain type of titer and the titer is alleged to confer immunity, then that's a basis for exemptions. So basically most people vaccinate according to their state requirements or according to the CDC recommendations. This is interesting from a 2015 report from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The median percentage of any exemption is 1.7%. So if you believe in herd immunity, which many of you may not at this point, but if you believed in it and it's 95, 96%, very, very high percentages, the number of exemptions would not appear in any way to threaten the alleged thresholds for herd immunity. There has been, though, this very all-out assault on exemptions that I'm sure you're aware of. And in particular in 2015, in the wake of the measles outbreak, there were efforts to introduce legislation to eradicate religious and philosophical exemptions. In a couple of states, it was successful, most notably in California, in kicking out a personal belief exemption and in restricting it in a couple of other states. But for the most part, people, mostly like you here in the audience, fought back and kept back any restrictions on existing exemptions. So another threat that people care a lot about in deciding not to vaccinate, according to mandates, is the threat of some intervention with one's children, Child Protective Services becoming involved. And Child Protective Services, in general, in 50 states, becomes involved if there are episodes or incidents of so-called medical neglect. So I don't know a lot about the practice here in the state of Washington. I can talk a little bit more about New York, but I did look up a brochure for child protective workers here in the state of Washington, and it says that the failure of a parent or caregiver to provide needed health care treatment for a condition that, if untreated, could result in illness can be reported as suspected medical neglect. I think one would interpret that likely as meaning that in the absence of any outbreak of a communicable disease, it would not constitute medical neglect not to vaccinate a child. I am not aware of a single case, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I'm not aware of a single case that's come to my attention where solely a parent's decision not to give routine childhood vaccines constituted medical neglect. I have, however, seen many cases from different states where the coupling of failure to vaccinate according to mandates has been paired with other parenting decisions that have constituted medical neglect. Okay, The third important question, so what happens? We know that vaccines aren't perfectly effective. We also know that they're not perfectly safe. No one medical intervention is going to be the same for every single person, although these are one-size-fits-all mandates. So what happens if somebody's injured? Can we sue? And if we can sue, who can we sue? So Congress, in its wisdom, in 1986 passed, in my mind, one of the most important dimensions of vaccine law in this country. And they said that basically you can't sue a vaccine manufacturer. The idea was that vaccines are so life-saving, they're so important, that they need liability protection. And in theory, this almost blanket liability protection was coupled with the requirement that people who are injured by vaccine mandates have to be able to get compensation. They're sort of victims in the war on infectious disease. And vaccines should become safer, right? We should have fewer injuries in the first place. Those are the three pillars of this law. It sounds good on paper. The reality has been that up until 1986, you could sue the manufacturers. And of course, it has a salutary effect on manufacturers. If they actually have a big judgment, as happens all the times with drugs, they may actually make them safer because there's a bottom line to pay if they don't. So what's happened since 1986 is you can't sue the manufacturers, almost in every circumstance, and instead you sue the government, and HHS, Health and Human Services, stands in the stead of the government. But one of the important dimensions of the 1986 Act is it acknowledged, for any of those who are still sort of arguing with people that vaccines are perfectly safe and perfectly effective, the law itself acknowledges that vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. They can result in injury or death that may be unavoidable, even if it's properly prepared and it has proper directions and warnings. So the law at least went that far in acknowledging that vaccines cause harm. An interpretation of that 1986 Act happened in 2011 in the Supreme Court. This doesn't relate to vaccine mandates as the other two decisions, but this was a very important decision in trying to interpret this 1986 Act and decide whether or not people could still go to court to claim that a particular vaccine was defectively designed. And what was really at stake at that time was including thimerosal, a mercury-containing preservative, in vaccines. That was really what was at issue. But the Brucewitz case was not about that. The Brucewitz case was about the diphtheria whole cell pertussis tetanus vaccine. And Hannah, who was injured by the whole cell vaccine, even though the acellular had been introduced more than 10 years before in Japan as a safer vaccine, she claimed that it was a defective design, that the manufacturer, Wyeth, knew at the time that there was a safer design that could be implemented that would be equally effective but that would cause less harm. And the Supreme Court, a lot more to say about this, but the Supreme Court said, no, we cannot have normal, regular people in juries making decisions about vaccine design defect. Only those specialists, experts, friends of the people at the FDA are in the position to really make these expert calls. And so colleagues and I have really sort of given this the acronym YOYO, you're on your own, right? You cannot sue for a defectively designed vaccine. Europe, fortunately, in 2017 over the summer, on essentially the same question related to the hepatitis B vaccine design, they said in the European Union Court of Justice that yes, you can sue for design. You can sue. Doesn't mean that it'll result in relief, but their doors are open at the courthouse, whereas ours are closed. And what this decision really means is that with no avenue for design defect and having the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which is set up under this 86 Act, 99% of claims for vaccine injury will never go to a normal court. That's just the reality of what we've seen since 1986. So one of the terrible dimensions from a legal standpoint about vaccine law and policy is that these questions never go to normal people in the community, and people, our peers, don't get to decide, is it more likely than not that this vaccine caused this child or this adult's harm? Essentially, that's been foreclosed. That's a huge problem. Okay, fourth question. Why do we have the vaccines that we do? Was this based on, people in the 1950s sitting around and saying, what are the most serious medical conditions that we can prevent with vaccines? Is that how it happened? I mean, one could argue that that would make sense, right? These are the most serious, these are deadly, these are causing the greatest amounts of harm. Is that how we came up with the vaccines that we do? Not really. There were experiments to do vaccines against yellow fever. There is yellow fever vaccine, scarlet fever, smallpox. Those were very injurious vaccines. It didn't seem like that the manufacturers could make those work on a mass basis. They were kind of dropped by the wayside at different times. But what we do see with drugs, and now especially with newer vaccines, is that manufacturers create a market and then they fill the need for the market. So we know for depression that, you advertise depression and then you say, oh, this is the perfect pill for depression. Or, you advertise restless leg syndrome and then you say this is the perfect treatment for that. And I'm going to show you a few slides on how cervical cancer awareness was the first step in advertising and promoting human papillomavirus vaccine. So the vaccines that we have are the vaccines that were possible. I don't have a slide of it, but for the measles vaccine, arguably measles is one of the most contagious and one of the most serious against which we vaccinate. The seminal article by the vaccine manufacturer said it's a disease of moderate severity and we have the vaccine because we could make it. So one of the things that really promotes the vaccines we have is fear, right? And the Centers for Disease Control has many modules for people about how do you invoke enough fear in people so that they will in fact go out and vaccinate. And our most recent sort of mass example of that was the 2015 measles outbreak. But to show you that they've tried with other vaccines and it just doesn't work and then they just pull them, is the example from 2002. So there was the threat of smallpox at that time after 9/11. There was envelopes with allegedly antigen of smallpox, or I think that was anthrax, but there was concern about use of smallpox, and President Bush tried to roll out a smallpox vaccine to healthcare providers. And there really wasn't obvious compensation. It was one that was likely and started to cause significant harm. People rejected it, and so that program got killed. But what we see now is very clear efforts to market diseases and market vaccines to go with them. You can prevent cancer. HPV vaccine is the key. I think this is a state logo and the money may come from the federal government. That is a very misleading statement, right? The vaccine itself is not against cancer. It's against a virus that can cause infections that in a very, very, very small percentage of cases could potentially lead to cancer. So you can prevent cancer with the HPV vaccine. Also, HPV is associated with several cancers. It is not associated with the vast number of cancers. And yet here we see this statement of you can prevent cancer as if it was going to prevent all cancers. Or here's another one. HPV vaccine is cancer prevention. This is how it's being sold. And here, this is marketing this directly to pre-teenagers, right? Marketing drugs to teenagers. Most countries make that illegal. The United States and New Zealand are the only two countries in the world that have direct-to-consumer drug advertising. Most countries think that's unethical and it's bad health care. Just a last one. Your daughter can't possibly know the importance of a cervical cancer vaccine, but thankfully she has her mom. So guilt-tripping parents, another really prominent feature, and this one is paid for by Gardasil, Merck being the manufacturer of this HPV vaccine. So also fear is a critical component to the vaccines we have. How do we make sure that people want to go out and get these? So this is a great one. CNN television, Disneyland measles outbreak spreads deadly virus blamed on anti-vaccine movement. So just to be clear, they've never ever come up with what they call the index case from Disneyland. We have no idea whether that person had been vaccinated. We don't really know if that person came from the Philippines, as they suggest. Many of the people who contracted measles at Disneyland had been fully vaccinated. But here we see not only the fear, the spreading disease, but also blame for the so-called anti-vaccine movement. Here's another one. This is done by the CDC itself. Get vaccinated, prevent and stop measles outbreaks. It can travel here and spread. So the rest of the world is invading. Only by vaccinating against the measles can we protect. But then it even points out here in the bottom that you can't just get a measles vaccine, you have to get the MMR. And guess what? Merck has a monopoly on the MMR vaccine. So last question, maybe we already answered this, but is vaccine promotion truthful? So knock out flu with one shot. I just said this is Washington State, right? And it's made possible with funds from the federal government. Knock out flu with one shot. I think what? They're saying that the current flu vaccine is somewhere between 10 and 60% effective, and in most cases, I think they're sort of on 30%. So does a 30% effective vaccine in the best case constitute knocking out flu with one shot? You could prevent cancer, HPV vaccine, that's it. Also, this one requires multiple doses, and the length of time that this lasts with any kind of titers is very questionable. The CDC's website, getting an annual flu vaccine is your first and best way to protect yourself and your family from the flu. What's the evidence of that? What's the proof of that? So false advertising is really about use of false, misleading, and unproven statements, particularly around health benefits. And if it's deliberately intended to mislead the consumer, that makes it more culpable. And we do have federal laws, we have state laws too, against fraudulent claims, making materially false, fraudulent statements or representations that harm consumers. I'm not aware of any serious cases being brought on those grounds, but certainly there are probably people looking at it. I saw this on Google Images. There are thousands of diseases out there, but the only ones you need to fear are the ones we have vaccines for. The vaccine industry. There's something to that. So why the vaccine push? I think we can't underestimate the real fear of communicable disease. I think it would be a mistake for us to forget that people really do fear outbreaks, and these diseases can have very serious complications. So that's a real factor in what's going on. But the other factors may be economic. Vaccines are very profitable. Their profit margins are in the double digits. There's 270 of them in the pipeline. A lot of blockbuster drugs of these manufacturers, pharmaceutical manufacturers, are coming off of patent. FDA testing is much less rigorous than it is for drugs. You don't have to have randomized controlled studies. You don't have to have the FDA actually do any studies on them. You can use other vaccines to test against as your placebos. You can have money from the government. The government works, the National Institutes of Health is working together with Merck and GlaxoSmithKline. And then mandates are the best of all, right? You just put it out there, the states require it, and then ka-ching, right? No marketing, no liability, essentially, under the 86 Act. So what's not to love? If you're a pharmaceutical manufacturer, what is not to love about vaccine mandates? But the people in this room, we are not alone in thinking that there is something terribly, terribly wrong with mandates and something terribly wrong with the way in which health is being skewed by vaccines. And so here's just a photo from the protests in California. The law passed, but not without enormous, vocal, resonant protest. This is just showing this is protest in Colombia. I had the privilege 2 weeks ago, to be working with the leading lawyer from Colombia, who's brought many successful cases, who got the Constitutional Court in Colombia to find any mandate for the HPV unconstitutional, and that lawyer is bringing a case to the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights about the HPV mandate in Colombia and the failure to get medical attention for those injured. And this is a photograph of the tens of thousands of people who marched in Italy in the summer against mandates there. So we are certainly not alone in this room in questioning the safety and efficacy of vaccines. So to conclude, in my opinion, mandates violate the human right to informed consent, and I think science and civil rights have evolved greatly since 1905. The laws are way behind. The 86 Act has led, I think empirically we can show that it's led to more dangerous vaccines and more injuries. And most injuries do not get compensation. Vaccines are very profitable and mandates are very desirable for industry. And yet, the future of medicine is personalized precision medicine. It's not mandates. So, thank you very much. Happy to Yes, I'd be happy to repeat any questions. Yes?
I just had a question about you noted several exemptions on there.
Yeah.
what are schools' responsibilities in accommodating those exemptions? For example, if you go in there and say have a religious exemption against vaccine A or C, are they required to accommodate for that?
So it very much depends on your state and how the exemptions are dealt with. And I'm not the best person to answer on Washington. Darla, if anybody here can answer that, Washington, I'd be happy to have you do that. In New York, where I'm from, New York has one of the most backward laws around religious exemptions. And so in New York, an individual has to prove that they have a genuine and sincere religious belief. And so it's very subjective. And the school districts often hire attorneys, and there's literally a kind of a religious inquisition in New York State. And it can go to court. And families can basically not get their exemptions acknowledged, and then the family is in the position of deciding whether to vaccinate or homeschool.
So does that change based on if it's a personal belief?
In New York State, you can't assert a personal belief. In New York State, there's no philosophical exemption yet. So there are efforts to introduce that legislation and to fix the religious exemption so that there's no, New Jersey, for instance, right across the river, has no inquiry. And so if one writes a letter to the school saying this is my religious belief, the school makes no further inquiry and accepts it. So it's very, very dependent on your state, how they deal with that.
And in our state, we have all 3 exemptions, and that's one of the things that we do at Informed Choice Washington is work to make sure that that never changes. So we have all 3 exemptions. All you have to do, though now it changed about 5 years ago, you have to see your healthcare provider, and they sign your exemption form saying that they have discussed the risks with you.
And do they have to sign it?
My understanding is they do, because you've actually discussed the risks with them, and it can be, and help me guys, it could be an MD, an ND, a DO, or an ARNP, or, yeah.
And I can speak to, I actually just helped my sister-in-law in Tacoma because she got a letter from, her kids go to the public school in Tacoma, and the letter came from the district nurse saying your child's behind, this is it's against the law. They use these words, it's against the law, this is required, and I said to her, you can call her with full confidence and say this is bogus, this is a complete lie, you are misleading the public, you need to educate yourself, I have an exemption and I have a right to it. So I helped her get that. So it's really up to the parents to
Actually,
help each other.
Yeah, let me add to that. So I was privileged to be with Darla and Bernadette in Olympia a couple days ago, and when they introduced 5 bills, Nat Shea, a legislator, and one of those, and we can look up which one it is, but one of those is the requirement that the school and the Department of Health communicate to people that there are exemptions available. One of the things that's happening around the country is that people are not making individuals aware of their right to an exemption, and that's just wrong.
I have a question. You may know the answer. We just relocated from California. I was there for SB 277, the whole thing. And in the Washington, the wording of the religious exemption, the way that it's stated is that you don't believe in any medical treatment at all, which is, I know in some states you can cross out and say, we actually have a medical exemption, so which we're lucky to obtain in California, but I wanted to know for sharing with other people, can they cross out and say, because people don't want to say we don't believe in medical treatment, that leads to CPS. I mean,
So, yes, just to clarify.
Darla, come speak here so that it's on
All of this information about the specifics of our exemption actually can be found on our website, Informed Choice Washington, which is informedchoicewa.com. And but just in short, there are 2. It's very strange and probably unconstitutional, but we have 2 forms of religious exemption in this state. On one side of the form, or on one part of it, it does have a section for if you do not use any kind of medical intervention at all, you do not have to have a doctor's signature. There probably are maybe 2 people in the state or something who do that. Then the other religious exemption is exactly like the other ones, I mean, like the other exemptions, the medical and the philosophical, they all have to be signed by your doctor. They're virtually the same. You're not explaining what the medical condition is or what the religion is or what your personal belief is. So it's really just which box you check, but they're all the same. They're all signed by the doctor. The other religious exemption is pretty much not relevant to anybody, almost anybody.
Okay. Well, I think just to say on this exemption, because I have, talked with or listened to many of the people supporting eradication of exemptions. So even though, as I showed you, there's no exemption in any state with more than 1.7% of people signed up for it, what they've observed accurately is that there's a very steep curve to the number of people asserting exemptions. People are concerned about the safety of vaccines and their efficacy for good reason. And so it's the slope of that curve that has, in their minds, justified these efforts to take away exemptions. Of course, the correct solution is look at the vaccines and allow people to make informed choices. But that's not the short-term solution that they've elected. And I think we have to recognize that 2015 was the last assault, orchestrated surely by those stakeholders, but throughout the country, and we would be silly to imagine that that's not going to happen again. It's just a question of sort of, when it happens and what the precipitating event is. Yes?
Concerning healthcare workers and potential exemptions, et cetera, I'm a local physician. Last year I was told by my hospital that if I didn't get the flu shot, I would have my privileges suspended. And this year, interestingly, it was that I could forego the flu shot, but then I would wear a mask and on the grounds at all times.
Yeah, so these coercive measures are being taken across the country against healthcare workers. There have been a couple of decisions by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that are quite favorable to nurses. A couple hospitals have had to pay damages and reinstate nurses based on the way they fired medical personnel for failure to take flu shots. But this is another part of the sort of onslaught. There's a couple attorneys who particularly specialize in exemptions. And so one has to look at what are the regulations in that state, what are the laws, what are the exemptions that you have in that state, and then you have to be very careful in how you frame your exemption. But the trend line to impose these on preschool teachers, to impose them on healthcare workers, the efforts to impose them on people in custodial situations, the elderly, these pressures are going to continue. I was, again, privileged to go with Drella and Bernadette yesterday, or the day before, to the Vaccine Advisory Committee for the state of Washington. And there were two, after they were very concerned about these introduced legislation at the beginning of their meeting, which was pleasant to see. There are two concerns that they will really focus on in upcoming meetings are so-called vaccine hesitancy. And I hope that you will all show up for that meeting and let them know what that's really about. And the other concern were elderly people in long-term care facilities and flu. So not just children are in the sights of people who believe in and promote vaccines. Yes.
Observation, in addition to the direct consumer advertising, and you showed examples in the PowerPoint, they have sort of indirect where they partner with, I'll just say, global corporations and kind of quid pro quo. Like, for example, if you get a flu shot, you get a free Subway gift card for $5.
Yep.
At Fred Meyer, which is owned by Kroger, they have banners outside the front of the store. Get one flu shot, provide one meal for a hungry family. And it's kind of priming to see how many people will accept it, and then they'll do the forced mandates as a subcurrent, and then maybe get the final lockdown.
The push on vaccines I just find extraordinary. I mean, you walk into a pharmacy and get your flu shot, get your pneumonia shot. You walk into an airport, get your flu shot. It's just, I didn't put up a slide for this, but several states now, close to 10 states, allow children as young as 9 years old to, exercise their quote-unquote informed consent and to get vaccines against sexually transmitted diseases. Some states allow children to make their own decisions in pharmacies to get vaccines. No medical record, no knowledge of their, genetic history, no knowledge if they've ever had that vaccine before. But that's the level of, what's the word I want? The overkill, the hard sell. The level of hard sell on vaccines is just remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Mary, do you think, it seems to me the 1986, that is huge, and then allowing the direct-to-consumer marketing, that's like the two pillars that have allowed them free reign. Is there any hope of either of those being overturned or pushed back? I mean, I know
I've
free
been working
reign.
at it. Right. I've been working at it. So on direct-to-consumer, I think there's a little bit more light, honestly. So literally, we're one of 2 countries in the world. Every other country, has laws against this. Even the American Medical Association, to my shock, in 2016 came out and said, DTC marketing is bad. We don't support this anymore. So that was a big shift in the American sort of pharmaceutical landscape. And I do know legislators in Washington who are really interested in this. And I think there's some interest in it on both sides of the political divide. So I could imagine in the near term there being some restrictions, not probably blanket restrictions, but I can imagine that. The 86 Act, pharma loves it, and there's the medical community loves it, healthcare practitioners love it in general, not people in this room. I, with a number of other people, gave a briefing on Capitol Hill a few years ago specifically about the 86 Act in preparation that we were going to have a hearing on the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And, we invited staffers and legislators to come. And after hearing our briefing, literally there was a campaign by, Every Child by Two and the, Immunization Action Coalition, and they just shut down the hearing. The hearing didn't happen. So the 86 Act, I think realistically, politically, is very hard to overturn right now. But I do believe that there's so much going on in this space that things could happen very quickly. I really do. I do believe that there are things that if they were to happen, things are unpredictable. And we do know that, more and more people are being injured by vaccines. More and more people are becoming aware of that. More and more people see it. More and more children are unvaccinated. It's like those kids don't have all these problems. So it's a question of time. How long is it going to take? I don't know. But it is a question of time. I mean, the future of medicine is not mandates. I mean, it's just absurd. It's literally absurd. And mandates go against everything in modern medicine. So it's slow, but we'll get there. Yes, in my program.
I think she was first. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please, go ahead.
Do you know what kind of evidence parents have to win a case from the VICP? Because if we could, for example, there's a well-known case right now, the Catones. Initially, the autopsy performed...
Wait, I'm sorry, a well-known case what?
The Catones, Nick Catone, his son. So what they're putting out on Facebook is that the initial test that the autopsy did would not have detected the evidence that they found, that she, being a nurse, knew the test to ask for to get the evidence that they say they have. So if we could, that would be very helpful in just proving how extensive vaccine injury is. If parents knew the evidence to get, how they're getting it, who has that information that we can say, if we hear about a SIDS case, say, ask for this test. Do you know who would have that information?
Marcella Piper Terry.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of people, but it really what needs, so there are many, the whole separate lecture, but there are so many problems with the injury compensation program. It's designed, in essence, to fail. It's designed so that people don't get compensated and so that it doesn't threaten the vaccine program. That's how it's evolved. I don't think it was set up that way, but I think that's certainly how it's evolved. But I think it's crucial for people, if their child has been vaccine injured, they need to get to qualified legal counsel immediately, which is very hard because many lawyers leave the field because it's so tortuous, it's so convoluted. But it's really crucial. There are some outstanding lawyers, and I'd be happy to talk with you after. There are some outstanding lawyers who practice in the program, and that's number one. And they know what the tests are that need to be done. And then there are families that have been compensated, or I'm sure in your midst you probably have some people. But the sad reality is that 2/3 of cases are dismissed. Thousands and thousands and thousands of cases never make it through the front door because of the 3-year statute of limitations. Most families don't recognize that their kids suffered a vaccine injury for a substantial period of time, or it may not have emerged. Their doctors may not have put anything in the record. Many doctors don't acknowledge, vaccine injury. I think it's fair to say that most of the special masters, who are the people who have to decide the facts of injury cases, most of them previously worked as government lawyers. So many of them, I do think, bring a certain bias to what they do, even though those cases are reviewed by the Court of Federal Claims and then by the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Once the facts have already been established, review is very hard to really undo what's been done. They can send it back, and sometimes they do. It's a vastly different system than if we never had the 86 Act. I truly believe that if we never had the 86 Act from Congress, we would have infinitely healthier children today, because people would have brought lawsuits, and they would have recognized far earlier, and common sense people in juries would have said, you're liable, period, as they did pre-86. So to me, one of the tragedies here was the 86 Act, and then the Supreme Court's interpretation of it, not to allow people to bring a claim. Mercury shouldn't be in vaccines. That's just pretty clear. And yet we can't contest that in a court of law.
Well, and doesn't the 86 Act also say that if you're unhappy with the judge,
right,
you can go on and
yes,
that's what vaccine.
It's a good
they
point.
Say that's a lot that anti-vaxxers say,
yeah.
And it seems like that's something just
so
reality's kind of panned.
So let me point that out. It's a very important point. So part of the basis on which the act was passed, because there were advocates for a sort of a pro-choice, informed consent point of view, Barbara Fisher, most notably of the National Vaccine Information, but she was at the table, together with healthcare providers, together with pharma. And the notion was that it was concurrent jurisdiction. You have to go first to the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, but there's nothing in theory, and this is true, there's nothing in theory that prevents you from then going and filing in a civil court. The problem with that is that if you didn't succeed in the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, where allegedly the standard's a little bit better, it's probably about the same, you may recognize that you're going to have a hard time proving your case. It's not easy to go up against pharma, and you're not going to get lawyers that you don't have to pay. One of the benefits of the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program is the government pays your lawyer. Now, that has some serious drawbacks. The government pays your lawyers. Your lawyers may not be quite as zealous as they would be under other circumstances because they know that their bill has to be paid by their adversaries de facto. So people then have to hire private lawyers. And what we see, looking at this experiment since 1988, when the program started, is 1% of cases goes up. That's the reality. 1% of cases go. Some of them do, and some of them, actually do end up in a civil judgment, but most of them don't. There have been a lot of, and the decisions in the compensation program are not binding in a regular civil court. But if the science is not sufficiently developed in that program, what makes a family confident that it's going to be sufficiently developed in a court of law? And there's filing deadlines and all of that. But one of the biggest problems, and Tatiana can speak to this more effectively than I, the science here is not what it should be. For mass use of these products, you would think that we would have robust science. You would think that there would be 5 strong, unvaxxed studies. You would think that we would have tested what is the impact of this 20 years out, 30 years out, 40 years out. None of that exists. It just doesn't exist. So it's fairly daunting to prove that a particular medical condition was caused by a vaccine. I think it's becoming more likely, but the science is developing, fortunately, on a global basis, but it's hard. Yeah.
If maybe you can help me with my wording. This is often a conversation, right? Try to link the pharmaceutical companies to the government agencies, and I tried to tell them they're in bed together. In and of the government agencies,
That works.
they can't accept grant funding from pharmaceutical companies, but the government agencies can set up foundations. Is that right? And that's how the money is funneled through.
Okay, so the question, sorry, I haven't even repeated the question. So the question is, how is it that pharma and government regulatory agencies seem to work hand in glove? So there's many different ways. It's not one way. So one of the most important ways, as you suggest, is that there's a CDC foundation. The pharmaceutical industry can put money into the foundation then can put people into positions working hand in glove within the agency. I think much more important than that, though, is that people who work for federal agencies, they may get a good pension, they may have good benefits, but they're not making huge amounts of money. One of the great things about working in the CDC or the FDA is many of those people turn around on a dime and then they go to work for pharma and they get stock options and they make millions and millions and millions of dollars. And so we see that over and over again. We see the revolving door. And I think that's the more powerful lever here. But then the other thing is, you know, there are people associated with the pharmaceutical industry who have very, you know, eyes and ears, and they're in government, and they're in the media, and they're in the legislature. When we were at the Vaccine Advisory Committee meeting in Washington 2 days ago, we were sitting next to several pharmaceutical corporate lobbyists. They're there all the time. We met with the legislators in Olympia a couple days ago, and they explained to us that, you know, the reps are there, the lobbyists are there, they're offering to take them out to dinner, they're making it clear that, you know, we would love to support you, you're a rising star. You know, campaign money comes with this. So there's many, many ways in which industry's influence is felt in legislators and regulatory bodies.
I remember in 1991 when the FDA and John Kessler got on a high horse about silicone and the concern about silicone breast implants, which of course led to this realization that there really was little or no science to show that they were safe. But that was true of most medical devices at that time because the level of rigor in the scientific community was such that it didn't exist. Sounds like, and of course, so then they were pulled off the shelf 16 or so years later, finally vetted back on as safe. But that sounds like exactly the situation here where there isn't science, but nobody's decreeing that. Because you did have, at that time, you had government involved, you had Dow Chemical, which was a big player, and this was all a big stub toe for everybody. What's changed, or what's?
You know, I don't know that I have the full history, but I can tell you I did look some I'm looking particularly at a particular what's gone on with the FDA and what they said about their science. And so after the Vioxx debacle for Merck in 2004, 2005, the FDA had a blue ribbon panel, and they said, basically, the American public is at risk. We just don't have the resources to do the science. And we let through bad science, and tens of thousands of people died as a result of our failure to review. And most importantly, we can't prevent this next time around. I mean, they acknowledged that. So that's the mid-2000s. I'm not sure exactly when and, you know, if there was a turning point there, but that's a pretty clear statement that they sort of, this one whistleblower there basically said, you know, we're going to have the same problems again. Yes. Thanks.
So now, well, we went to Olympia the other day, Michelle and I. We went and talked to one of the reps, and it is true that there's no oversight committee, correct? That like a regulatory agency that's actually making sure that there's the correct vaccine science being done, and it's like, who's holding them accountable to? I mean, they have a free rein to do what they want with the 1986 Act and all this stuff, but do they really have nobody to answer to?
No, that would be inaccurate. So there is a whole licensure process, and you know, they do, pharmaceutical companies that have produced vaccines, they do have to have clinical trials, they do have to submit their findings to the FDA, they do have to have it licensed by the FDA, they have to go to multiple levels of clinical trials, it has to be approved by the FDA, and there's hearings along the way. once it's approved by the FDA, then post-marketing surveillance is much more limited than what happens during clinical trials. After it's been approved by the FDA, what most vaccine manufacturers want is they want to turn around and go to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, because that's where they can get it recommended by the federal government, and then presto changeo, basically there's no liability, right? So if things go down, they can't be sued because they have liability protection. That also allows the government to purchase that vaccine for the Vaccines for Children program, which accounts for more than half of the vaccine sales in the country. So there's this sort of FDA process, and then there's this CDC advisory process. The problem is that most of the people who are considered to be appropriate advisors in the FDA or the CDC, they have to get waivers for their conflicts of interest. In the studies that have been done in Congress about these advisory committees, and these people own stock, these people have invented vaccines, these people have had many appointments with the vaccine manufacturers. Oftentimes, the human papillomavirus vaccine, for instance, was a public-private partnership. It was invented by people in the National Institute of Health. And then it was licensed to GlaxoSmithKline and to Merck. The HHS actually gets royalties from the manufacturer. So it's just, yes, there are regulatory procedures. Do they really work?
Well, it's just
that's not so clear.
Right. And what I guess I'm just so, and I don't know if anybody else feels this way, but it's like I'm just so dumbfounded that these people aren't saying, well, where's like the double-blind placebo study? Like, how do they stamp off on stuff when these scientists should know the proper protocol? And
so I can't fully explain this. Maybe Tatiana can explain this better. But I think one of the rationales for not having what we would think of as being necessary controls, people who are unvaccinated prospective study versus people who get the vaccine, is the notion that they're so life-saving that it would be unethical to have people not be vaccinated to control against. And so what we see is, like, for the human papillomavirus vaccine, they're testing it against, the carrier, they're testing it against the adjuvants, or they're testing it against other vaccines. To me, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So what we see from my perspective is there's a much lower level of rigor in vaccine safety than there is for drugs, both pre-licensure and post-licensure, because we are the drug testers of last resort. If you take like Vioxx, people were suing. There's $1 billion settlement, multi-billion-dollar settlement for Vioxx. It killed people. But we can't do that for vaccines because of this liability protection that I believe that the people who signed up for it in Congress at the time, they imagined that it would, in fact, be the right compromise. It's clear to me that it was absolutely the wrong compromise, and it has incentivized riskier vaccines, more vaccines, and huge unknowns. I mean, we just don't know what the long-term effects of what we're doing are. Yeah.
I know that the mandates are on a state-by-state basis. However, in terms of I'll just call it the national climate or the national administration, I'll refer specifically to a press conference. One of the Kennedy Juniors who's written a book, and Robert De Niro,
right.
There was a press conference and there were some politicians there. Mm-hmm. Do you see under the more national umbrella that it's a more favorable climate right now, possibly? Cloud break?
Well, there's one very positive development that happened 2 days ago, and it could be significant. Time will tell. So 2 days ago, this administration announced an Office of Civil Rights within Health and Human Services, and it's called the Office of Civil Rights and Freedom of Conscience, something like that. And there's a video, and they had a press conference about it. And it's specifically being talked about as a way for people who don't believe in abortion or who don't believe in certain medical procedures to avoid them based on conscience. It doesn't specifically mention vaccines, but it is clear that it pertains to vaccines. And I know that Dr. Ken Stoller, I'm told, in California, has already filed a complaint with this civil rights body about vaccines. And I'll bet there are already many complaints that have been filed. So that's a ray of light. I think arguably this current administration may be more open to claims of conscience overriding mandates than recent administrations. The fact that Bobby Kennedy had a press conference on Capitol Hill, I was there that day, I went and met with some of the people in Washington. It's a long dance, it's a long dance. We need everybody involved. It's got to be from the ground up. This is never going to be from the top down. There's just too many people whose jobs and prestige and money are related to this that it would be top down. It's not going to be top down. It's going to be bottom up, the change. So people like Bobby Kennedy, who is really working hard on this issue, and Robert De Niro and a colleague in film, they're doing another film, and there are films in the works that are going to be powerful. They all need grassroots support.
Is there anything going with William Thompson with the whistleblower, or is that
So, as probably many of you know, William Thompson was the scientist at CDC who, in private phone conversations with Dr. Brian Hooker, acknowledged that he had committed fraud and malfeasance in CDC research related to the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and autism. And the question is, has anything happened with William Thompson? And there are efforts right now to subpoena him in a court case, which may or may not, in several court cases, I should say. There are efforts, he's acknowledged through his lawyer. So he, through a lawyer, made a statement acknowledging those conversations. So he's not denied those conversations, and he said that he is willing to testify under oath if subpoenaed. He was subpoenaed in a court case in Tennessee a year ago. And the CDC, while he was still an employee, the CDC said, no, you don't really need to hear from William Thompson. We will not relieve him from his duties to go testify. There are other court cases that are in the process of seeking to subpoena him. Whether or not, I don't think Congress is going to do anything. So I and others made significant efforts to have the Committee of Oversight and Government Reform, the OGR Committee, have a hearing about the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program and to invite William Thompson to testify. That's not going to happen. That one's not going to happen. But he may well be subpoenaed to testify in a court case, which would be huge. If we could have him under oath testify to what he saw and what went down with respect to MMR and thimerosal at the CDC, it would be one of those events that could break the wall. Right? Anybody else?
How does the CDC trump the subpoena? How does the CDC how does that happen?
How it happens was they wrote to the General Counsel's office, so they have to give permission. And the head of the CDC wrote back and said he can't testify to anything that someone else can't testify to. I mean, it was justification. They can do that.
The court can't imagine.
I don't know. The court didn't in that particular case. So, but it doesn't mean that it's over, and I think there may be new developments on that. Yes.
So given that you're definitely in an academic climate, public health schools, universities nationwide, are the educational systems skewed towards pro-vaccination, kind of landlocked, so to speak, educationally?
Yeah, this is a very controversial / stigmatized conversation. Anybody who, like me, says there are issues here that are worth discussing, kind of gets an eye roll, like, really?
And these are your colleagues?
These are my colleagues, not all of them. I mean, I have colleagues who are very open-minded, and I'm incredibly grateful for them. And so I have been invited. I was invited to speak at Emory last year, which is sort of the partner university to the CDC. So that was kind of cool. I was on panels with CDC lawyers. So, it's not a totally excluded conversation, but, in my hallways in my school, there are signs, get your flu vaccine, wash your hands, but get your flu vaccine. And there are certainly people who think that it's unbecoming to an academic to entertain these sort of, theories. So, I mean, there's fortunately, not being in a medical school or a school of public health, I have been blessed that people have been supportive, that I'm publishing law review articles, I'm lecturing at academic institutions, I'm doing what you do in this kind of work. So I certainly don't feel as if I have been censored or in any way discouraged from doing what I'm doing, and I'm tremendously grateful for that. But I think, sadly, colleagues in the medical school, colleagues at the School of Public Health, colleagues in other parts of academia, even in science, have not been so fortunate. And they have, in essence, been shut down and shut out of academic institutions. And that's crazy. I mean, if there should be one place that's open to controversy and discussing hard, important social issues, it should be universities.
Absolutely.
So for me, it is, I consider it a privilege to be in an academic institution to work on these things.
Yeah, sure appreciate it.
Yes?
I'm not sure if this is the proper setting for this question, because I know that the vitamin K injection for newborns isn't really classified under the vaccine schedule, but I actually work for a large healthcare up north, and they have a refusal form for the vitamin K. Currently not for Hep B yet, but they have a refusal form for vitamin K. And reading over this, just because my daughter is now pregnant, it is only one-sided. It does not give you the risk factors. It only gives you everything horrible that can happen to your baby if you don't get the vitamin K. But
and is it coercive language? Does it basically say you will be depriving your baby of this?
Yes, your baby will die. Yes.
Yeah.
So
it's very coercive language. I mean, if I had to sign, if it were me and I were in a position where I was in, did not want to give vitamin K and I was in a health facility like that, I would cross out that language. I have heard of horror stories. I have heard of horror stories from moms in, delivery rooms where they, in essence, have been threatened with child protective services. I mean, those stories are real. So I can't guarantee that wouldn't happen, but that's coercive language. That is coerced speech. I do believe some of these forms that force you to say something that you do not believe, I do believe those are First Amendment violations of free speech. I do believe one could contest those in a court, and I do believe that some general counsel in a hospital would understand that. And so I think you start with saying, you cross it out and you say this is a violation of my First Amendment rights and I'm prepared to take this to your legal department. And that might push them back enough so that they let her go.
And you would know from a legal perspective, I was just sort of naively doing my own thing. When my son was born in California, I wrote out my birth plan. And I had my OB sign it, and it was declining what I wanted to decline. I pre-registered at the hospital, put it on file, and so you're covering your bases. Bring a copy, have it in your hand,
and don't let the baby out of your
Isn't that something
it's crazy, but it's real.
That.
It's very real.
Yeah.
And I know it's hard for us to believe, but I do believe that most of the nurses who would be administering Hep B and vitamin K in the hospital, they imagine that they're doing the right thing. So it's so important. Basically, just don't let that happen. Don't let the baby get out of the mom or the dad's sight or whoever.
I think your safest bet, given how things are right now, is to make sure you have a doctor for the baby who already supports your way of doing things, because at least in this state, if CPS even starts to get involved, all you need is a doctor to simply disagree with what they're saying is neglect or whatever.
Right,
So
that's easier said than done.
Right.
I have done hours and hours and hours of research for my grandbabies. I mean, I spent a lot of time on the computer researching, and yes, there are naturopaths out there, but my two children prefer a pediatrician, okay? I can't go against her, which is I'm the grandparent. Luckily, they are starting to listen to me about this stuff. But it is very, very difficult to find a pediatrician in Washington State. I just found one. We're going to be driving an hour and a half to go see next week for a meet and greet. But it is very difficult.
It's worth it if you can find that in action, someone who supports the same, the same philosophies.
Last question.
What's the statute of limitations for death?
In the vaccine injury compensation program, I believe it's 3 years.
I've been hearing it's 2 years.
I've been hearing people say that the statute is a 3-year statute of limitation. I don't think that's accurate.
Okay. Because I just wanted to verify, because I really have heard it all.
You know, I can check it. I haven't specifically gone back to look, but the statute of limitations is 3 years. I'm not aware it's shortened for doubt, but I'd be happy to look with you on that. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, this might be for Drella. You know that slide you put up about in 2015, there was all those bills. What's the update on our philosophical bill or exemption being removed?
Okay, well, I can.
Do you want to come up? Yeah, I'm done.
Are we?
We're done, and Bill can come and address the legislative issue.